Yes. Well, what do you think?
Well, why don't I introduce the lecture series and then you can introduce Mitch.
Okay.
So thank you everybody for attending. This is the Dallas Free Lecture Series, and this is co-hosted by Unity Church in absentia with D2 Counseling. We haven't met at Unity Church in several months now, but they still participate with us, and we're delighted that this has been an opportunity to continue with them through Zoom. We've continued to try to refine the process. If you would like CEUs, then we'd ask that you send us an email. I posted it in the chat to info@D2Counseling. And then later on as we go, if you would like to submit questions in the chat for Mitch, he'll be comprehensive, so there probably won't need to be too many questions answered by him. But if you do come up with something that he doesn't cover that you have an interest in, post that question over there, and if we have time towards the end, we'll get to the questions and Mitch can address that. I would mention that next month we have Ann Heinrich is going to speak on challenges around adoptive and foster parenting. And so that'll be an interesting presentation. And with that, I'll hand it to my co-founder, Dr. Dina Hijazi, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. We don't know when we're going to be back live, and I just wanted to get a show of hands of people that like this format. So those of you that have the camera on, yeah, we've gotten some really good feedback that people are wanting this. So we may do some sort of hybrid, or we don't know yet, but we certainly are happy that we have this as an option so we can keep the lecture series going. So thank you for showing up every month. Mitch is presenting tonight. Mitch is a unique individual. He's a very, very gifted therapist and good friend of mine. We met at a training years ago, and we did several trainings together, and then we formed a friendship and a really good relationship as colleagues, and I'm learning a lot from you, Mitch. You have gone on to do something that very few people do, which is to get the intense training in somatic experience, and not many people in Dallas have that. So he's somebody that has been very specifically trained and has advanced training in a certain technique that he will introduce and infuse in his lecture tonight. So thank you for being here, Mitch, and welcome.
Thank you, Dina. I so appreciate having me here. Very honored, and you know, I'm really excited to talk about this concept of addiction interaction, and it's something that, you know, you mentioned we met at a training years ago, and this is where I was first introduced to this topic, and it's near and dear to my heart because just like a lot of trainings, we are challenged to do the work ourselves. And so all throughout our talk today, I'm going to share a little bit about myself and just some of my experience in interacting with this concept and some of this material, and I hope it can be of benefit to you as well. And so I'm excited to also answer questions at the end, and you know, get you information and resources to support you if you're here personally, for yourself, or if you're a clinician or somebody in the field. Hopefully there's a little bit of everything for everyone. So hopefully it's of benefit to you. So I'm going to bear with me as I pull up my slides for you. Let's see. Oh, Daniel, I think it says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
That's not helpful for you, is it? So I think what we have to do is let me hand you the hosting.
Okay, awesome.
You should have it now.
All right. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Is that visible? Awesome. All right. Well, you know, I mentioned this idea of addiction interaction, and it's really a simple concept that we address our addiction the way that it naturally occurs in our lives and in everyday life. And so I'll be talking today not just about addiction, but I'll also be talking about, I think this is very applicable to any behaviors that we have that may not rise to the level of addiction, but that are problematic in some way. And so I may also be using terms like problematic behaviors, addiction, that, you know, I'm using a little bit more generally, in a general sense. So hopefully after today, you'll be able to define what addiction interaction is, identify, describe the different types of addiction interaction, and then also have some hopefully useful key questions that you can use to develop some self-awareness, and also just develop and promote a healthy lifestyle. Now, I do want to give a disclaimer that this is not meant to be a replacement for therapy and doing some of that deeper work with somebody that's trained and skilled. So as I was thinking about tonight's presentation, you know, I work mainly with people with addiction issues, and as Dina said, in mentioning somatic experiencing, I see a lot of trauma. And so I just started thinking about, okay, what are some of the challenges in addiction recovery? And I think a challenge that we have in the therapy counseling field, psychology field, is that I don't think, and I include myself in this sometimes too, I don't think we address addiction from the right perspective, the right framework. You know, I think that we tried to, and we were limited to our resources to address the addiction in a vacuum space, and then expect people to then leave and figure it out, right? And that's where we have 12-step groups and support groups to support and hopefully in the moment, here and now type of situations. And that's where the real learning takes place. So, you know, some of the challenges is developing these healthy coping behaviors and mechanisms and relationships. We want to help heal and resolve underlying issues. But really this presentation is going to be focusing on relapse and chronic relapse. And so I want to propose one potential source for why relapse is such a common occurrence. I'm sure I can get some challenges after my talk, but I'd be more than happy to have some discussions about it. So I want to make a case for addiction interaction. And there's a lot of different views out there about addiction and what we can be addicted to and what we can't be or not addicted to. So I think a good place to start would be, how do problematic behaviors develop neurobiologically? And so I want you to think with me for a second and just close your eyes. And I want you to think about your favorite food. And I want you to picture that food in your mind. And quietly to yourself, just describe that food to yourself. all the details, the nuances, maybe even the environment in which you are tasting this food. Noticing it as you chew it in your mouth. Noticing the taste, just taking your time enjoying it. And so as you do that, I want you to notice any shifts in your emotions or in your body or physical sensations. When you're ready, you can open your eyes. And so some of you may have experienced a shift, some of you may not. But my point in asking you to do that and taking a few moments is that what we know is that anytime we experience something pleasurable, our brain in the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, produces dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter. And I'm sure most of you have heard of this, but then it sends the dopamine through the reward system and the learning center of our brain. This is where we have, very intense survival drives. This is how we learn. And so then the dopamine gets sent along to our prefrontal cortex. This is our conscious rational part of our brain, our executive decision-making part of our brain. And so the dopamine tells our conscious brain, that felt really good. That tasted really good. That was such an enjoyable experience. And once that happens, then our brain sends back a neurotransmitter called glutamate. And glutamate says, remember that. That was really, really good. Remember this. And so what's in the same area as the, near the reward system in the nucleus accumbens is the hippocampus. And that's the memory center of our brain. And so there's this intricate system that is there to help us to learn, to enjoy life, feel pleasure. And it's something very natural that occurs from day to day. Whether we're eating food, whether we're drinking alcohol, whether we're watching TV or gambling, this process is taking place. And dare I say, looking at our phones. Just the other day, somebody shared with me for the first time the grayscale setting on my phone. And I thought this was really interesting, so I wanted to try it out. And I had to Google it. It's actually a very complex process trying to find this thing on my iPhone. But once I did and I set it, guys, immediately I did not enjoy my phone as much. I got on social media, I opened some apps, I was browsing the internet, and I already found myself wanting to click the color back on. And sometimes I do. And when I do, it's almost this immediate rush of a more vivid experience. So the case that I'm making is that even though this is a natural process, this is also, through what we know up to this point, is how problematic behaviors and addiction develop. When we take this process and we discover something that helps us to alter how we're feeling. And again, that could be a substance, that could be a behavior, that could be a relationship or a relational dynamic, or that could even be certain emotion states as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what happens as we develop problematic behaviors, our brain doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't know what to do with the flood of dopamine that comes in that's not necessarily normal. So let's say I'm drinking alcohol and I find that alcohol really helps me to de-stress, and it helps me to regulate my anxiety. And so I continue to do that over and over and over again. Well, the brain is a beautiful instrument. It shuts down the dopamine receptors as a way to manage the flood of dopamine. And when it does that, I need to release more dopamine than I normally do in order to feel the same amount of pleasure, in order to alter my mood, my anxiety. And so over time, that can develop a tolerance that I need more dopamine in order to feel okay and normal. And so over time, what we believe is that that's how neurobiologically that develops. And we develop a problematic behavior or addiction as well. So I want to introduce a concept before the addiction interaction that goes along with this development of addiction as these neural pathways develop in our minds through problematic behaviors, that there are 4 major neural pathways that we develop with problematic behaviors and addiction. And so those 4 neural pathways are arousal, numbing and satiation, fantasy preoccupation, and deprivation. Now these, I don't want to give these impressions that this is something pathological. These are very normal experiences in our lives, and also very normal operations within our brains and our minds. And so we have arousal, which is very normal. This is feeling of pleasure, sexual pleasure, adventure and excitement. We have numbing and satiation, or this experience of fullness and satisfaction. So these 2 specifically, another way to say it, and what I have found with the clients that I meet with is that they're like, okay, so I have certain specific biases or pictures of what arousal and numbing looks like, but I don't really know what that means normally in regular everyday life. And so sometimes what they respond well to is that arousal is about activation of the nervous system. And so, we have, and I decided not to include a slide in here about window of tolerance, but some of you may know this concept of window of tolerance. And so anytime that we get out of our window of tolerance and we experience worry or excitement or anger, there's the activation of our nervous system. And then numbing, I like to think of as a deactivation of our nervous system. There's a relaxation of the nervous system. And this is a very healthy thing. So that could be eating our favorite meal and feeling a sense of fullness and satisfaction. That could be feeling a sense of contentment with a certain activity that we're doing. Sitting in front of the TV, common that we hear all the time is, we're binging on Netflix or whatever it may be. It's very normal to want to kind of experience that satiation, that relaxation. Fantasy preoccupation is also, I would say more on the fantasy side, is also very normal. Watching a good movie, inventiveness, creativeness, getting outside of our reality for a time is very normal and healthy. And also deprivation, withholding something from ourselves for a greater purpose or a specific reason. So all these things are very natural, but then when it becomes problematic, we start to discover ways that we can utilize these pathways and these specific pathways to drive why we engage in certain behaviors, and then come back to it again and again and again as a way to alter how we're feeling as well. So keeping in mind those neural pathways, let's talk a little bit about addiction interaction. And so addiction interaction, this model or framework for addressing addiction was developed by Patrick Carnes. He's done a lot of research and proposed this model a number of years ago. And he defines addiction interaction as a phenomenon where multiple addictions combine to overwhelm a person by its complexity and power. And what I would say is, if it's not known and understood in the unique patterns of the person, then it's going to be very difficult to then develop a good plan in how to prevent relapse. And so, he says addictions more than coexist, they interact and reinforce each other. So I want to propose that instead of looking at for yourself, for each of us, or for a client that comes into your office, it is not about just the drinking problem that person's coming into your office for, but that we have to look at this from the framework of, okay, so how does this person's eating habits, how does this person's spending and shopping behaviors, let's look at all these different aspects of our lives, and not just how they may occur, but how they interact and affect and reinforce each other to where they actually develop into its own unique pattern for each of us. So based upon that, who does this impact? Who does this affect? Well, it can affect individuals, but it could also affect systems as well, including family systems, even larger groups such as communities or cultures. And so an example of this, as far as a family system goes, if you have someone who is a problematic drinker, then you have within a system other parts of that system that will react and respond accordingly. And so looking at that system, maybe a partner or spouse or a son or daughter withdraws and isolates. Maybe a son starts playing more video games, starts playing it compulsively, right? And so how does that compulsive gaming interact with dad's drinking? Or how does the daughter's compulsive eating or restricting interact with dad's drinking, so on and so forth. So this is a framework that is not just individualistic, but also can be applied systemically or systematically as well. And how does this affect us? Using typical addiction criteria, loss of control, negative consequences, or even an incongruence of priorities and values as well. So this is the model. As you see in the center, you see the 4 neural pathways that we spoke of a moment ago. But things to consider for yourself or to consider for someone you're meeting with are 4 major groups. We have substances, processes, and appetites, core affect states. I get into a lot of deep philosophical discussions with some people about that category and whether that can be addictive or not. And then also relationships. And so these lists aren't obviously meant to be exhaustive, but to kind of get you jump started in thinking about, okay, what are some of these areas that I can be looking at and exploring. And so just to mention the core affect states, that may seem kind of strange to some of you, and it certainly does for me sometimes when I think about it, but if you think about some of the emotions that we feel, let's say when we feel anxiety or we feel anger, when we feel some of these things, there's times where our bodies release certain neurochemicals or hormones such as adrenaline or cortisol. And if we've experienced for example, a very stressful childhood, where we have adverse experiences or trauma, where there's a lot of intensity, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, then our bodies can grow accustomed to releasing and experiencing these emotion states. And so in some ways, we can find ourselves, and I don't want to get out of the scope of today's talk, but we can find ourselves engaging or just experiencing certain trauma responses, for example, where we find ourselves kind of compulsively going back to and putting ourselves in certain intense situations that will release some of these hormones and neurochemicals, and also accompany some compulsive behavior as well. So, but we also have relationships that can provide that altering type of action of changing how we feel and going back to a certain relationship, along with some of the other things that you see here as well. Processes and appetites, just to tell a quick story, to go off of what Dina shared about me having young ones. I found myself, just as many parents do, with one, I could handle that. It was crazy. It was something new, but with two, that was just, and now I have three, but when I had two, I was just too overwhelmed. And what I would do, and I feel a lot of shame coming up right now, but I would take my kids, strap them into their car seats, to keep them stationary. I don't want them moving. I want to be able to control things, right? And then I would bring them to the grocery store, put them in the shopping cart, strap them in. That's very important. You got to strap them in so they can't move again. And then I would find myself literally just mindlessly roaming the aisles of the grocery store. I mean, literally, I found myself there one time for an hour and a half, just roaming aisles. And then it just hit me one day that I'm totally just escaping. I'm totally just kind of numbing out and just buying, oh, that looks really good. That looks really good. And so the idea of shopping and spending comes to mind for myself, along with work and sex as well. So that is just a little description of the model. And as we move forward, I'll talk a little bit about, okay, so how do we put all this together? What does this actually look like in exploring? Because I know this is a lot of information. But before we do that, I want to talk about, okay, what are the patterns of interactions? So I said before that we all have unique patterns, but I think through Carnes's research, but also my own experience, I do see very common patterns with some of the people that I meet with. And I want to go through some of these with you. So first we have cross-tolerance. And this can look a few different ways, but the more common is this simultaneous increase in two addictive behaviors at the same time. They could be within one neural pathway, but they don't necessarily have to be. But a good way to think about cross-tolerance is using the analogy of transferring majors in college. So think about transferring majors in college, and you have a certain number of credits that you've already earned, and a majority of those credits are going to transfer over to the other major that you're transferring to. And that's where cross-tolerance is that credit is transferring over. That development of tolerance for one addiction is going to immediately transfer over to this other addiction. So the time it takes to develop the tolerance normally is not needed. we just jump right into that high level of intense addictive activity as well. So that's cross tolerance. And we also have withdrawal mediation. This is where we use one addiction to moderate or relieve or avoid the effects, the withdrawal effects of another. When I think about this one, guys, I think about, has anybody watched the movie Flight with Denzel Washington? Yeah, Daniel has, Shannon. So I always think about this when I think about that movie. And if any of you have not seen it, I don't want to give anything away, but he has a drinking problem. He's a pilot. He has a drinking problem. And I'm not going to go into all the facts, but he has to testify before a panel of people evaluating his behavior. And so the idea is that he doesn't want to drink before this upcoming really important testifying, and he ends up, I hate to get away, but he ends up drinking. And he has a buddy, John Goodman, who comes over and brings in some cocaine for him. And what he was doing was trying to help him to moderate the effects of the alcohol so that he could testify. And so, I think that's one example of, a problematic behavior being used or serving to moderate the effects of another as well. We have replacement. A lot of people think about this. When it comes to addiction, this is one of the big fears, right? Is I don't want to replace it just with something else. And that's the argument for addressing the underlying issues. What's unique about this is that usually and commonly there's time that is in between. So with cross tolerance, we see that there's a simultaneous, and you'll see some others that have some of those characteristics. But with this one, you'll have one addiction that a person may learn how to manage or get into recovery and abstain. And then maybe 6 months or a year go by, and then they replace it with something else. So work habits or, with gambling, whatever it may be, but it still takes on the same emotional and psychological characteristics of the first addiction. Alternating cycles are unique patterns that we may develop. And a good example of that, for example, would be, let's say I experience sexual binging in my life, and then I get into a very high intensity, maybe even abusive relationship. And then there is an ending of that relationship, and then I isolate and drink or use. And my use escalates, and then I attempt to curb my use in some way, and then start the pattern all over again. And so then I binge sexually once my use goes down, and then I get into a high intensity relationship, and then that relationship ends, and then I go into another pattern and escalating use, substance use as well. So these patterns can look in innumerable myriad of ways as well. And so that's why it's so important to explore these patterns for yourself or for clients. Masking, this is one behavior to cover up the use of another. And so this can be done intentionally, and usually we're trying to cover up something that may seem less shameful, or maybe even more intense, something less acceptable by our family, loved ones, etc. And so I'll just engage in this and try to cover that up with the other thing. So an example of that may be, you know, I'm going to drink some alcohol, which is more out in the open. But at the same time, I'm also going to be gambling, but I don't want anybody to know about my gambling because I'm a few $100,000 in. And so those are simultaneously going on at the same time. We have ritualizing, where one behavior serves as the ritual for the other, or you could have a ritual that serves for multiple addictions as well. What I like to think about, a good example of this is getting on my phone or a device or an app where I gamble and I act out sexually in obviously compulsive way as well. So there's an emphasis on the ritual of going through preparing for and then engaging in the addictive behavior. And we have intensification and fusion. And so if you see A, B, and C here, there's just an escalation or intensification of the different behaviors from episodic use, but they're also very independent, to a partial combining to heighten the high or the pleasure of the particular combination of substances or behaviors, and then a full combination or fusion of these. And so this illustration will kind of visually illustrate for you different examples. So in more independent use, and then they gradually start to come together. So there's this escalation that starts to take place between certain substances or behaviors. And then we have numbing, and I want to share a little bit about this, just an example of myself. So this is what really hit me as I was learning more about this model. And this model is very common for people who have experienced trauma in their history. I think the name is a little deceiving because a typical pattern that we see with the numbing is actually a drive for intensity, for that arousal neural pathway, and then a shift to utilizing the numbing neural pathway. So I'm going to pursue intensity, arousal, and then I'm going to pursue a deactivation of my nervous system as well. So, you know, this really hit me in my life as I was doing my own work and doing this. And what I learned was I have a trauma history myself, and one thing that I would experience in my family system is very intense interaction with my parents, my sister, and then once those intense conflicts and interactions were over or completed, then we will all separate into our own rooms and disconnect. And so this pattern started for me very early on in my life, where there would be this high intensity and then this numbing. So early on, high intensity conflict, go to my room, watch TV, play video games. And I would just repeat that over and over and over again throughout my development. And I found, okay, so numbing behaviors like gaming and TV can really help me to feel differently, feel better, or not feel at all in some instances. But as I got older, because of the developing technology, then I discovered pornography, then I discovered sex, then I discovered, so all these things I discovered that I would use to experience this and repeat this arousal and this intensity. And then I would turn to food and TV and gaming and my devices as a way to numb. So there's this arousal, numbing, arousal, numbing. And even though, you know, I've done some work and learned how to manage, you know, these addictive behaviors, I still engage in the arousal and the numbing, the arousal and the numbing. And for me, I want to be aware of when and how and why I'm engaging in that, so I can manage it in a healthy way for myself. So now what I discovered is I don't do it with necessarily porn per se, but I do it with work. I get my intensity with work. If there's any other therapists out there, I know you experience intensity as well. And so I get my intensity there. I get my intensity from emergencies and, you know, hurtful, wounding things that people are going through. And so I'm experiencing that, and I have to be very careful to be mindful of that for myself and how that's impacting me. But I still get that arousal. And then after a long day, let's go eat a whole large cheese pizza by myself. Let's go numb. And so I still have those desires, but the key is self-awareness in when it's happening or why it's happening, and hopefully also weaving in some healthy behaviors as well. So we also have inhibiting and disinhibiting. So one behavior, and this is unique from masking, where one behavior I'm using to substitute or in lieu of something else more destructive or disturbing or harming of others. And so I'm going to use one over another, and disinhibiting is the opposite. I'm going to use one as a way to help me use the other or engage in the other behavior as well. And then the last is combining, and this is like finding the perfect high. I'm going to combine different substances, different behaviors. You know, I'm going to use an upper and a downer, and combine those effects to experience that perfect sweet spot in between. And very commonly, this will be a pattern in which, you know, we may want to prolong the high or the experience or the windfall fantasy in gambling as long as we possibly can as well. So those are the different types of patterns. But then we want to throw something else into the mix. Not like we don't already have enough here, but this is also very key for me as well, is that I always used to think that addictions come in the form of compulsive behavior. And what I have come to learn and what I see very vividly and clearly with my clients is that there's a flip side to the same coin, which are deprivations. And all this is an aversion or a restriction of a particular need or behavior. And this commonly comes through learning, through past experiences, that having needs are dangerous for us. That maybe we'll be rejected, or we will be ridiculed, or maybe even physically or sexually harmed because we have a need. And so we uncontrollably have a need to avoid certain behaviors or certain needs. And so just like addiction, there could be shame at the core of this. And so deprivations or restricting behaviors actually share very common characteristics with compulsive behavior as well. And commonly, we will experience compulsive and restricting behaviors simultaneously in our lives. Maybe we will, well, let me go here. So on one end, we have compulsivity. The other end, we have deprivation. And so let's say on one end, I'm compulsively engaging sexually in one relationship, and then I'm aversive and restricting in another relationship sexually. Or I'm compulsive with my eating and overeating, and I'm depriving sexually and restricting sexually. And so this could happen individually. This could happen within a family system where there's this interaction between the addictive compulsive behavior and the restricting as well. So you can see here, and this is from Fossum and Mason in their book, Facing Shame, of acting out and acting in. So out of control behaviors, along with an over control of behavior. So risk taking versus risk aversion. I'm overeating, I'm overspending in some areas, and I'm over exercising, I'm avoiding intimacy with my partner, so to speak. So in the most recent issue of Psychology Today, I was just reading this the other day, and I thought it just really stood out to me, really hit me, thinking about deprivation and addiction. By the author is Susan Burton, an article in the August issue titled, the article titled Satisfied. She said, I hadn't binged in years, and this is kind of a memoir of her disordered eating. I hadn't binged in years. Eating had shifted into not eating, an equation of undoing. What I didn't see or refused to was that this was an equivalency. Eating was the same as not eating. Both used food to manage feeling as well. And so I think that's a good illustration of restricting versus compulsivity as well. And that can happen simultaneously again, or that can happen, as she's saying, years later in her life. So some key questions here, and just certain things to just think about for ourselves or for our clients. How do I acquire the substance use or behavior? So, you know, I want to encourage just a deep curiosity and attention to detail. And so we'll talk about an exercise here in a minute, but how do I get to the actual behavior of the substance? What precedes it? Tell me all that happens during, while you're using or while you're drinking. What are you doing? Who are you talking to? What is the environment? And then all that follows it as well. How do I feel when I have a need? Do I feel comfortable having the need? Do I feel comfortable communicating the need? Do I feel shame? Do I feel, anxiety? And then we get into the next two questions are just getting into that compulsivity deprivation type of pattern or just experience, right? So engaging excessively in certain behaviors versus finding yourself avoiding or aversive to certain behaviors. And then finally, what other substances or processes and appetites, relationships and emotions, those key categories we mentioned before, how are they involved with each other? Let me explore some of this. So just some key questions to consider when thinking about our behaviors from this framework. So some exercises for clinicians. Most of us are very familiar with timelines, but in regards to addictions, I think it's really important to look at some key things that go along with those addictions or problematic behaviors. There are major events, obviously, that we want to look at, significant relationships, but we also want to look at the problematic behaviors and addictions and look at the chronological order of these addictions and problematic behaviors and also deprivations, looking at the onset, looking at key events, looking at examples of unmanageability. So in doing this timeline with the client, we're looking at identifying phases and patterns and themes that go along with all of those problematic behaviors. So we're looking at one, but then we're looking at them all together as a whole. What picture is this painting as we look at this systemically? And then there's also the neuropathic interview. And so we talked before that there are 4 neural pathways to addiction: arousal, numbing, fantasy preoccupation, and deprivation. And so in this exercise, what we want to do is to explore a relapse scenario, and probably more than one, and exhausting the options of the most common relapse scenarios, and literally go through the sequence of events as well. And we want to look at what are the payoffs for each of these behaviors. And so, if I'm going from the high stakes poker game to the bar to then being with the escort or prostitute, I want to explore each of those and how they work together and what the payoffs, what is driving me? Is it I'm trying to stimulate from feeling depressed, and then am I trying to settle and deactivate my system? Just looking at those neural pathways from the different scenarios there as well. So a couple of observations. We need to view our addictions, deprivations, and problematic behaviors not individually, but as a constellation. So we want to, I think it's so important to address and looking at things holistically, addressing these problematic behaviors simultaneously, but then also understanding what are the ends that I'm trying to achieve through these behaviors. So no doubt in therapy, are we looking at the underlying issues? There's underlying mental health issues, mood disorders, trauma, absolutely. But I think it's so crucial to also understand these very unique, ingrained patterns, unique patterns that a lot of us have. So knowing these drivers and these end effects can really open up discussion on how to prevent the relapses from occurring. Yeah, so that's all I got. Thank you. I know there was I wanted to pause there and just allow for questions. That seemed a little more natural to me, but yeah, would love to hear from people.
Thanks, Mitch.
Yeah.
I don't see any questions. We do have a fairly manageable group. If anybody has a question and would like to unmute themselves, feel free to.
Yeah. Go for it. Don't be shy.
Yeah, you didn't, this is Travis. You didn't mention anything. Hey, how are you? You didn't mention anything about like health related issues. And I was just curious if you see patterns of health related issues with people with addictions as well, where that becomes something that's used to either deflect or manage sort of the person's relationship with their families and kind of, you know, their social circles, as a way to kind of prevent people from focusing on their drinking or their, you know, abuse, because they've always got other concerns that are should be more important to the family. And I'm speaking specifically of the particular, you know, incident that I'm working through right now with someone.
Yeah, yeah. So let me see if I understand. So, you know, maybe the person is diabetic, and that seems to always come to the forefront when, you know, maybe a problematic behavior is trying to be addressed by the family member or whatever it may be. Is that kind of an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, it's like that. It's also sort of like, I would actually say it's almost, it's not made up, but it's like sort of, I know that like emotional pain in the body can cause physical things to happen as well. There's a connection between the two. And so the reaction or the physical pain is always the thing that's presented as being the problematic thing versus, oh, I'm also drinking a lot. And so the focus is always meant to kind of keep your focus over on, well, I've got this physical symptom and that's actually why I drink. They're kind of used together. It feels very difficult because obviously the physical thing is real. It's a real experience. But there's not necessarily like a diagnosed condition like diabetes or something. I'm actually saying more when there's just sort of always this physical syndrome that's sort of
physical manifestation of the stress or the anxiety or the trauma that's occurred.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's wow. That sounds really, really tough. In how to navigate that, you know, and one thing that I did not, and you're absolutely right, Travis, one thing that I did not discuss is the mental health side of this. You know, I think it was, I'm just looking at some notes here. And I know you're talking about physical illness, but all I have right now is looking at some notes on mental illness, right? So, you know, in a 2018 national survey by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, 13% with substance use disorders met criteria for addiction for multiple substances as well. So you're looking at about 2.5 million people. So it doesn't speak directly to what you're saying, but it's very, very common that if we see a substance use disorder, the study says that there's a strong correlation of one substance use disorder, strongly correlated with polysubstance use and other mental health issues as well. And so very commonly, we're going to see not just a substance use disorder, but also a health issue or something underlying that. And it must be addressed at the same time, simultaneously, right? So obviously, if it's acute, if the substance use is acute, we have to get that under control, right? In order to address those other issues. But once things are stabilized a little bit, then we have to address both at the same time. So if we're looking at some physical manifestations, I mean, I find myself wondering, okay, being curious about that. What else? What are you experiencing? Where do you experience this in your body, et cetera? And obviously, a disclaimer that that would be with a professional, because if there is trauma in our history, focusing on our bodies can actually trigger or even reinforce the trauma and the trauma response as well. So it really depends on what the physical ailment or illness or manifestation is.
Makes sense.
Yeah, if it's an injury versus a disease versus, trauma response, stress reactions, that type of thing, you would go in different directions. As far as addressing it, how to address it with that person, as far as communication, that's looking more at effective communication and boundary setting and that type of thing as well. So
Sure.
I heard some laughing there.
That's my mom.
Well, maybe we can do some family therapy.
That's why we're
No,
here.
it has to do with the fact that when you're dealing with boundary setting with someone who has addiction, oftentimes what you're dealing with is that slippery slope where you set a boundary and then they have to have a new source or of supply in terms of your attention, your time, or whatever. So it's like the boundary markers just keep getting moved.
Yes.
And that makes it really, really difficult, especially when you have kind of an undiagnosed illness in which the person just says, gee, I'm having all of these symptoms, but nobody can find anything.
Right. And as Travis, as you said, it can be very real.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that to me, what stands out to me is, at least from your end, is, okay, so how do we navigate this with our loved one? And how do we take care of ourselves, not selfishly, but in order to be present for them? So that sounds more like, okay, so family dynamics issue and communication and boundary setting, that type of thing.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anybody else? Any questions? I don't think I covered it all. Daniel, I did not cover it all, Daniel.
Hey, Mitch, somebody was asking, is there a chance, could they get a copy of the PowerPoint? Is that available or not?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll have, I can put it in PDF form.
Okay.
And email it to you. And
yeah, so one thing I'll just mention again, I posted it in the comments. Anybody who would like CEUs, if you'd like a copy of Mitch's PDF, send us an email at info@d2counseling.com and we can get either or both of those to you.
Okay.
Another question, Anna?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Mitchell, for such an excellent presentation. So well organized, so practical, such wonderful resource. I'm delighted that you're going to make your PDF available. I took some snapshots of some of your slides as we went along. And I'd like to ask you to speak towards trying to treat the addiction problems along with the underlying mental health problems. Do the mental health problems pretty much need to be resolved before people can resolve the addictions?
yeah, that's absolutely right. I think I very rarely, if at all, ever see someone that's wrestling with problematic or addictive behavior without there being some kind of underlying issue. And kind of what I mentioned before, if it depends on how acute the situation is when a person first comes in, and addressing and helping the person or the family system to gain some stability with the particular addiction, right? So that we need to stop the bleeding, so to speak. So I think about someone with a gambling addiction, gambling disorder, and if they just continue to gamble while they're trying to work on it, that's not going to be very helpful because they're still in that addiction cycle. So we need some stability first. And so it may look behavioral in the beginning, or getting of support, etc. But as soon as possible, we want to address things simultaneously, because as I said in the beginning of the presentation, the framework we want to use needs to be as similar as possible to how we experience the issues in everyday life. So if we address things just individually all throughout therapy or treatment, then we're not really addressing it as how it presents in real life. So we need to address it both simultaneously. So when somebody first comes in, we want to not only talk about the addiction, but we want to holistically look at other areas of their life. How's your mood? How are your relationships? You know, if they're married or they have a family and children, and major events, any significant events or trauma in their history, that type of thing. Very common, some diagnoses that are very common that I see. Typically the people that I see for addiction are young adults and professionals. What I commonly see is anxiety, depression, ADHD, and trauma. I think trauma is the biggest. Usually presents as anxiety, and can commonly be mistaken for anxiety as well. So I don't know if that answered your question, Anna.
Yes, thank you. It's all interconnected, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and another thing I want to say, Anna, if someone presents with some depression, for example, very commonly we'll see, I'll see someone who is maybe compulsively using stimulants or engaging in high risk behavior as a way to help lift their depressive state. Or if I see someone who is consistently living in this heightened state of anxiety or stress, commonly see them engaging in more of those numbing behaviors, or using depressants or something like that as well. So there may also be some connection there with the underlying mental health issues.
Mitch, I wanted to ask you at the first slide or one of the first slides where you had the circle and you had the 4 different neural pathways, and then you had the examples of each category of numbing, deprivation, and then you had one corner, it's the bottom left corner, that you said, and I've had many philosophical and spiritual discussions here.
I don't know about spiritual, but yeah, it could be spiritual.
Oh, philosophical, okay. What were you referring to?
Yeah, you know, I've had some colleagues who I presented this to as an idea, and they were all for it until I started talking about maybe compulsive attachment to certain emotion states.
Yeah.
And these colleagues I've had conversations with are very versed in you know, neurobiology and our physiology and that type of thing. And so I'm trying to remember exactly what their you know, they said, so then Mitch, I can just be addicted to being happy. Is that what you're saying? And so the way that I remember it, it was more about the argument and the conversation than it was about the actual topic. But I do think that for some of those things that were listed there, even I think, okay, is that really, can I really be compulsive or have that attachment, that mood attachment? So I think about something like rage. So we've all heard, you know, term rageaholic, for example. someone who can't control their anger. And that can be something that maybe we can wrap our minds around, where the person, when they get angry and they rage, they're releasing adrenaline. Adrenaline's running through their bodies. They're these, maybe even stress hormones or whatever it may be that's being released. And so our bodies can grow accustomed to those hormones. But then there may be some other emotions that we say, okay, but can I be attached to contentment or joy or in a problematic way? And I think that's where the person was coming from in having some of those conversations. I think we can wrap our minds around, gambling, certain behaviors, even with sex. Some clinicians, some people believe, and there's an argument that sex cannot be an addiction. And so I think that there are a variety of different perspectives and opinions about what that could be, what's involved in some of those behaviors and experiences there. So I don't know if I answered your question. I didn't get into too many specifics about it, but yeah.
Well, I think it's bringing up the complexity of all of us and the complexity of our habitual behaviors and our attachments that can get out of balance pretty quickly.
Right.
And I think we can, at least I can talk about depression as being an attachment, that it becomes the mood of choice. And I have worked with people that give themselves permission to go lay down because they're depressed and they step out of life for a while. And that's it fits right into that quadrant of a numbing behavior really easily. So I think,
avoiding you sleep or along with that, I'm just going to go sleep for 15 hours. Yeah.
Yes. And I think, we're just clever humans. We can find all kinds of crafty ways to escape and avoid what we don't want to deal with.
That's right.
So thank you for that. Has anybody else got a question before we stop?
Yes. Can you mentioned a book called Facing Shame? Could you give me that information again?
Sure. It's by Fossum and Mason. You should. It's a classic. It's not something that was written just last year.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a great book, and it addresses some of the things that we mentioned here.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. There's also another book called Craving for Ecstasy. I believe it's by. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the neurobiology and the four neural pathways that we talked about, Milkman and Sunderworth, Craving for Ecstasy, is a great resource as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Mitch, thank you. I've learned a lot, and it's really made me question people that say, oh, just do one thing at a time. First quit drinking, but go ahead, keep the smoking. And if you gain 50 pounds because you're stopping the drinking, that's okay. It really makes me wonder if that's the best way, the best paradigm to operate under. So thanks for all that information, and thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Mitch, one last question that I think is very, very critical. What is the 7-year-old doing for school? Is it Zoom or in person?
Oh my gosh, don't bring this up. Oh, talk about wanting to go numb.
Yeah. Well, good luck with that, whatever that ends up. But we appreciate
Thank you.
you.
Yeah, we're still trying to decide on that one.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. And next month we have Ann Heinrich that's going to speak on foster and adoptive parenting and challenges in that way. And we will look forward to your participation there. And thank everybody for attending today.
And send us ideas if you want topics to be covered to the info@D2 Counseling so we can address those as well. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mitch.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Mitch, you're still host. You can either hand that back to me or just
Yes.
log out as you go.
Yes, let me,
Great job, Mitch.
thank you. Let's see. Thanks, Dina.